The scream never comes. Only a sound metal shrieking against bone. A thud like thunder hitting frozen earth. And then a silence, so complete it drowns out 1,000 horrified gasps. January 24th. Year 1536. In the tilt yard of Greenwich Palace, King Henry VIII, a colossus in 60 pounds of golden steel, collapses under the weight of his own warhorse. For 2 hours, the most powerful man in England does not move, and in this alternate history, he never does. This is not a story of survival. It is a story of what never got the chance to happen. No monstrous decline. Not 6 wives. No bloodied axe at the Tower for Anne Boleyn. No broken Elizabeth left to become Gloriana. Instead, this is a story of power snatched from the jaws of chaos. Of a pregnant queen walking a tightrope above execution. Of secret councils in darkened rooms. Of Protestant plots and Catholic rebellions. Of foreign princes. And of a kingdom teetering on the brink of civil war, all born from a single breath that never returned. The death of Henry VIII is announced not with mourning but with paralysis. No will. No clear successor. No precedent. The legal heir is a 2-year-old girl Elizabeth, but her legitimacy is doubted by half the country. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, a man who rose from a Putney forge to the heights of power, sees the truth faster than anyone else. The Queen must live, and her unborn child must be a boy, or they will all burn. Anne Boleyn, once the seductive threat to Catholic order, becomes the eye of the storm. A widow without a crown, a prisoner of her own womb. If she births a girl, she will fall. If she births a boy, England may be saved. Cromwell's Itis London. The Treasury. The Tower. A Regency Council is declared in haste. While in the north, the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, readies an army to restore the old ways, to put Princess Mary, the Catholic daughter of Catherine of Aragon, back into power. Then, in spring, a miracle Anne gives birth to a healthy son, and in an instant, the storm shatters. The boy is crowned King Henry IX, and his mother becomes Queen Regent, the most powerful woman in the world. Norfolk bends the knee. Cromwell, now her iron right hand, begins a purge. Their enemies are exiled, imprisoned, or destroyed, and England is reforged not into the moderate compromise of Anglicanism, but into a radical Protestant fortress, a machine of reform, revolution, and control. There is no Jane Seymour, no Anne of Cleves, no Catherine Howard, no Catherine Parr. The king never marries again, because he is dead. But his legacy lives through his children, not the ones of our history, but versions we never met. Young Henry IX, raised as a Protestant messiah. Elizabeth, no longer a haunted orphan, but a brilliant princess, trained in power beside her mother and Cromwell. Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, married off to a German heretic to silence her forever. And so, England changes. No bloody purge of Protestants. No reversal back to Catholicism. No solitary queen facing the Spanish Armada. Instead, a stable dynasty. A king who believes in his divine right and rules with godly authority. A navy born from monastery gold. And a reformation made ruthless and total. The Tudor dynasty endures unshaken, but gone with it is the chaos, the heartbreak, the stories that made legends. This is a world without Gloriana. No virgin queen, no Shakespeare's London, no golden age lit by candles and blood. Henry's death spared his kingdom the worst of him, but it also denied the world the magnificent tragedy of his children. This is the cost of stability, the death of the unpredictable, the end of myth. But now, we will go deeper, into the nights where Anne Boleyn held her belly and prayed for a son, into the councils where Cromwell gambled his life on loyalty, into the fire that tried to swallow England whole, and the woman who turned it to ash. This is the story of the king who died too soon, and the queen who rose in his place. The horse was still groaning. Its heavy chest heaved slowly in the frosted air, blood pooling beneath the twisted metal of its armor, steam rising faintly like incense from a battlefield that had no prayer, and under it unmoving, cold, and grotesquely silent, lay a man the world feared more than any dragon or plague. His helmet was crushed at the rim, his gauntlets curled unnaturally. Like claws, the great roaring lion of England had been swallowed by silence, and in the gallery of the tilt-yard, surrounded by lords who no longer dared speak, Anne Boleyn stood without moving, one hand clasped over the child she carried, the other curled tightly around the rail as if it alone could keep her from falling. She would not scream. She could not, because if he was dead, then she was nothing but a widow with enemies sharpening knives. For 2 hours, they waited, but unlike in the pages of history we remember, this time he did not stir. And so it began. Not with a royal funeral, not with the tolling of bells, but with whispers. The first whisper was not, "The king is dead." It was, instead, "What now?" For what is England without Henry Tudor, without the man who broke Rome and burned bridges with the Pope for love, without the king who married 1,000 hopes and killed nearly as many dreams? Anne did not weep. She did not faint. She did not fall to her knees or tear her hair out. Instead, she turned, almost mechanically, and walked back to her chambers like a ghost made flesh. There, she ordered the doors locked. No ladies in waiting. No food. No tears. She pressed both hands against her belly and whispered to the child that had not yet opened its eyes to the world. "You must live. You must be a son, or we both die." In the city below, smoke curled from chimneys and silence fell in the corridors of the court. Thomas Cromwell clever, common-born, dangerous. Thomas moved faster than any noble. Before the king's corpse had even been laid out, he had locked the gates of the tower, secured the treasury, and called a council at sword point. There would be no chaos, no Catholic princess crowned in haste, no reversal of the new church he had sacrificed everything to build. But power is a jealous mistress. In the north, the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's uncle by blood, but her enemy by design, heard the news and smiled like a wolf. He had always despised her, the heretic girl who dared dethrone a Spanish princess. Now, with Henry gone, he would be the one to restore the rightful order. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, would be queen. The monks would return. The heretics would burn. And Anne Boleyn would kneel before God for her sins on a scaffold. She knew it too, and she did not sleep. Each night, in the long darkness of late winter, she sat alone with her fears. Her handmaidens whispered that she spoke to the child inside her, that she named it again and again. Henry. Henry. Henry, praying the echo would become prophecy. There were moments when she bled. Not much, but enough to make her breath catch. Enough to remind her that not even queens can command biology. Cromwell came to her door in secret. He did not kneel. He did not bow. They were past ceremony now. He simply said, "Give me a son, and I will give you a crown." She nodded once, and they understood each other. Through icy weeks and dead-eyed days, the kingdom lived in a kind of suspended exhale. The banners above palaces were not lowered. The churches did not yet hold requiem, for no one quite dared to say the words aloud. A regency council had been declared, led by Cromwell and backed by Anne's authority, but it was a castle built on mist. One wrong birth, one failed breath, and it would vanish. Then, in the green tremble of early spring, as the snow melted from stone and swans returned to the Thames, the Queen's cries pierced the palace walls. Labor had begun. They say she screamed, not in pain, but in fury, as if fighting the world, as if daring it to stop her. Outside the chamber, nobles paced, some with swords, some with prayers, and some with hopes that the infant would be stillborn. A girl. Or worse, none at all. The stakes were too sharp for mercy now. Ours passed. And then a cry. Not hers. A boy. The infant was swaddled in cloth of gold, before his eyes had even adjusted to the light. Anne was too weak to speak. But when they held him to her chest, her tears finally fell. Not for love, not for grief, but for survival. Henry IX, King of England, had been born into a throne made of blood and ash, and with that single breath from tiny lungs, the fate of 1,000 nobles turned. Norfolk abandoned his ambitions and rode south in surrender. Bishop Stephen Gardiner locked his doors and waited for his summons. Mary, the once proud daughter of Catherine, was sent from court under armed guard. Anne had won, but victory is not peace. The girl who once danced in silks now ruled in armor. Her smile became rare, her laughter extinct. She wore black, not for mourning, but for warning. Those who came to her court seeking favor were met with cold eyes and cold decisions. She was not the seductress anymore. She was regent. She was mother to a king. And she was building a new England, one that did not need Henry, did not want Rome, and would never again beg for legitimacy. In this world, Anne Boleyn did not die in the tower. She built one around herself, and somewhere in the shadows of the chapel, beneath the stained glass and the new hymns sung in English, the ghost of a fallen king stirred restlessly in his tomb. History had not stopped with his death. It had only changed direction. The child wandered through marble corridors, beneath painted ceilings where angels never wept. Her steps made no sound on carpets thick enough to swallow secrets. And the guards who stood at every archway bowed not only to her birth, but to the woman who had made that birth into power. This was not the Elizabeth of our histories, the watchful orphan with a mother's ghost hanging over her cradle and a father's wrath behind every whisper. This Elizabeth had never been called bastard. She had never seen the doors of a nunnery from the wrong side. She had never wondered if love could be withdrawn like a favor, or if her head might one day roll for someone else's mistakes. No, this Elizabeth was different. She was born in the sun, not in shadow. From the moment her brother, Henry IX, breathed his first breath and claimed the crown that lay cold on their dead father's chest, she became not an afterthought, but a pillar, not an inconvenient girl, but the beloved elder daughter of a living queen. Anne Boleyn did not forget her. She did not hide her. She did not silence her with false humility and whisper that girls must walk quietly. No, Anne had bled for power. She would not now deny it to her daughter. So Elizabeth sat beside the regent at council meetings before she knew the weight of the words they used. She listened to Cromwell argue policy and watched her mother's fingers tap once, twice, 3 times on the table when she was displeased. She learned to read faces like texts, to weigh silence like coin. She knew the names of every noble who had once wished for her mother's head, and she did not forget them. Outside the court, England was changing faster than seasons. The monasteries were being torn apart with clean, professional violence. Not burned, dismantled, their lands resold, their gold melted, their influence gutted. Schools rose where chapels fell. Latin vanished from the liturgy like smoke. English prayers, sharp and simple, replaced old incantations. Protestantism was no longer rebellion. It was law. It was nation. It was truth. Inside the nursery halls of Whitehall, young Henry grew strong on Protestant milk. His tutors were handpicked by Cranmer himself, men of Europe, men of thought, men who had fled Rome's wrath and now returned to build a godlier kingdom. He was quiet, thoughtful, stubborn, and from the first, there was something of Anne in his eyes, the ability to look at a room and know where the danger stood, even if it smiled. But this part of the tale is not his. It is hers. Elizabeth, the girl who should have grown up fearing shadows, instead grew up watching her mother wield them, and she watched her mother change. Anne Boleyn had once been laughter. She had once been flirtation and poetry and danger wrapped in perfume. But now she was power carved from stone. She did not forgive. She did not forget. She did not falter. Those who had turned their backs on her when Henry fell were never welcomed again. Norfolk was gone. Gardiner was under lock and penance. Mary, daughter of Catherine, was stripped of title and sent away in political marriage to a German prince who despised her religion. Elizabeth heard the rumours of how her mother had insisted on the match, of how Cromwell had forced it through with bribes and threats, of how Mary wept when she left. She did not cry for her cousin. She only watched her mother that night. As Anne sat before the fire, staring at the flames, her hand curled around a goblet of wine, but never lifting it to her lips. Anne said only one thing that night: "No one will take your crown from you. Ever." Elizabeth remembered that. She remembered everything. And so she learned swordplay. Yes, but also rhetoric. Classical Latin. Yes, but also the Protestant writers of Zurich and Wittenberg. She read Machiavelli at 13 and argued theology with Cranmer before her 14th winter. She did not kneel unless the gesture served a purpose. And when foreign envoys came to court, they reported home not of a sweet princess of delicate breeding, but of a girl who watched them with eyes too old for her years. She adored her brother, but she understood, with eerie clarity, that her fate was tied to his strength. If he faltered, she would be the one expected to rise. So she trained, not in swordsmanship, but in presence. By the time she turned 15, she could enter a room and silence it. Behind it all, Anne watched her daughter with a strange, restless hunger, as if she loved her. Yes, but also studied her testing to see if the girl had inherited not her face, but her fire. The Queen Regent had survived a kingdom that tried to kill her. She would not leave behind children who did not know how to kill back. Still, there were moments, fleeting and private, when the iron cracked. Elizabeth once woke from fever in the night to find her mother sitting beside her bed, her fingers tracing a hymn on the bedsheet, lips moving without sound. When the fever broke, Anne only said, "God is not kind, so you must be strong." It was the closest she ever came to saying, "I love you." Outside, the world continued to shift. France eyed England with suspicion. The Pope snarled an excommunication. The Emperor Charles cursed the German marriage that stole his cousin Mary and wrote bitter letters no one answered. But new army came. No Catholic crusade landed on Kentish shores. Cromwell's spies ensured silence. Anne's coin ensured loyalty. And young Henry's birth had ensured unity for now. Elizabeth knew it would not last. She knew every peace was just the space between wars. And when she looked in the mirror, she did not see a princess. She saw the shadow of a throne her brother sat upon, and the sword that would fall on her neck if he ever stumbled. But she did not fear. She had never been taught to fear, only to wait. And to be ready, it began with parchment. Not swords, not ships, not smoke rising over Dover. No horns of war or banners fluttering at the border. No. The attack came folded in wax and sealed in crimson. A letter from Emperor Charles of the Holy Roman Empire, written not in fury, but in ice, addressed to Anne, styling her not as queen, but as the widow of the usurper. It demanded, not asked, the return of Princess Mary to Catholic custody, sitting bloodline, sanctity, divine law. Anne read the letter once, then again, then tore it into long, deliberate strips without saying a word. The fire that devoured it crackled like applause. But she understood the meaning It was not merely insult. It was a prelude. The world had allowed her to rule because it expected her to stumble, to fracture, to bleed herself dry, keeping nobles in check and Protestants in power, but she had not bled. Not again. And so now, with her son still in swaddling cloth, and her daughter approaching womanhood, the world remembered it hated her. They could not take her by force, not yet, but they could isolate her, and they began with whispers. The French court sent no ambassador that spring. The Vatican issued a new bull, declaring all sacraments in England invalid. Spain blocked English ships from its harbours. And behind each manoeuvre, behind each closing door, loomed Charles' uncle to Mary, former father-in-law to Catherine of Aragon, and the wounded lion of Catholic Christendom. He could not let Anne Boleyn's world stand, but he could not afford a war either. Not with France at his back and the Ottomans pressing at his flanks. So he sought the oldest weapon in the box, marriage. If he could not unseat Anne, he would plant his bloodline inside her kingdom. The proposal came through a minor bishop, with shaking hands. He offered Mary yes. Mary, the Catholic princess exiled and humiliated to return, but only if married to a Spanish prince of Charles's choosing. England would retain peace, dignity, and trading rights. Mary would swear fealty to her brother, Henry IX, and renounce all Catholic claims. Cromwell laughed first. Anne did not laugh. She stared at the messenger until he dropped his eyes. Then she asked one question. And what dowry comes with betrayal? The answer was silence. She sent him back with no reply. Instead, she called for Cranmer, for Cromwell, for maps of Europe, lists of Protestant dukes and princes, of Lutheran sons without brides, of reformist heirs with ships. England would answer marriage with marriage, but not with Mary. With Elizabeth, Cranmer hesitated. She was young, untried, still learning the art of statecraft. Anne did not care. She is mine, she said. Let the world see what my blood can become. And so began the quiet war of diplomats. Letters carried in darkness. Tokens of hair and miniature portraits traded across borders like chess pieces. Elizabeth, barely 16, was painted twice. Dressed once in English red and once in Saxon gold. One portrait was sent to the court of Hesse, another to Brandenburg, and while Catholic Europe seethed in incense and muttered in Latin, the Protestant courts of the north whispered with interest. But not all were pleased. There were those in England, old men in crumbling abbeys, young knights with rosaries hidden in armour, who watched these moves with fear. They did not love Rome, but they hated Anne more. To see her daughter offered as a queen in her own right was salt in a wound they had hoped would scab over with time. Some plotted, some prayed, some wrote anonymous letters to Charles begging for aid. He read them all, and waited. Then came the choice. The Elector of Saxony, a lion of the Protestant cause, sent word he would accept Elizabeth's hand for his eldest son, not as concubine, not as pawn, but as equal consort, a match made not in desperation, but in alliance, in belief, a Protestant crown married to a Protestant court. It was everything Anne dreamed and everything Charles feared, for with this match, England would not be a renegade kingdom. It would be the spine of a new order, a true Protestant Europe. So the emperor made his last move. He ordered a fleet to gather not for invasion, but for intimidation. Ships with golden prows, painted saints on their sails, cannons polished for ceremony. Not war. They docked near Calais, close enough to be seen from the English coast on a clear day, close enough for rumours to drift across the channel like storm winds. Anne stood on the cliffs at Dover in midnight black and watched the sails like they were ghosts. Beside her stood Elizabeth. Neither of them spoke, until Anne said, "This is what they do when they know they've already lost." Elizabeth did not answer, but her eyes, so young, so sharp, held no fear. The fleet stayed for 3 days, then vanished. And when it did, Elizabeth's betrothal was sealed. The letters were signed, the portrait accepted, the dowries agreed. In the following spring, she would leave England, not in exile, but in triumph. Not a hostage, but a symbol. And as she walked through the halls of Whitehall, the lords bowed more deeply than before. They saw in her not just a daughter of Anne, but a future beyond Anne. But Anne saw something else. She saw the cost. A child given to a cause, a girl sent into the world because the world would never stop clawing at England's throat. She had survived the hatred of queens, the silence of nobles, the indifference of her dead husband. But now she had to survive her children growing into weapons. That night, she sat beside young Henry's cradle and did not speak. She did not weep. She simply held the crown in her lap and waited for dawn, knowing the real war was still coming, and it would not be fought with ships. In the absence of a king's footsteps, echoing down marble halls and thrones weighed by male flesh, the air of England thickened with something colder, something harder, something sharper than mere grief, for there was no mourning to be had for Henry Tudor now. Not in the corridors of power, not in the minds of those who survived him, because the kingdom had been forced to move before it was ready, to bleed before it could scar, to kneel before it could pray. And at the centre of that enforced motion stood a woman whose womb had bought her survival and whose silence had sharpened into law, Anne Boleyn. The Queen Regent of England, the mother of a crowned boy too young to speak, and a daughter who spoke like thunder when she was asked nothing at all. A woman who did not pretend to be gentle anymore, who wore her power not as ornament but as armour, and who governed with a steadiness so unflinching that even her enemies began to call it fate rather than tyranny. As if to name it otherwise would invite fire, the years that followed Henry's death did not open slowly like a spring thaw. They crashed forward like a wave that had waited too long behind a dam. And with Cromwell at her side, Anne set about reforging a kingdom that had once bent its knees to Rome and now would never bow to anyone again, not the Pope, not the Emperor, not the French, and certainly not the dead, whose ghosts still prowled the abbeys and empty cloisters of monasteries, torn stone by stone from the soil like rotten teeth. Their bells melted into musket barrels, their relics broken and sold by the cartload to pay for ships, for schools, for spies, for a future that no longer included saints or Latin or mercy. The dissolution of the monasteries, which under Henry had begun as a violent act of greed and ended in chaos, now became under Anne and Cromwell a brutal, methodical purge, not just of buildings, but of memory. Parishes were emptied, abbots put to trial under reformed ecclesiastical courts, and the land redistributed not to appease nobility, but to raise a new class of educated, loyal Protestant gentry, men who owed their titles not to birth but to the Queen's pen and the King's infant crown, and who would fight with pens and pikes alike to preserve the order that had birthed them. For they had no nostalgia, only allegiance. In Whitehall, the Queen rarely smiled and never forgave. Those who had hesitated during the Regency crisis found their names scratched from court rolls, their lands audited, their sons passed over for commission or patronage, not out of vengeance but principle. For Anne had seen what indecision bred, what kindness cost, and she would not gamble the lives of her children on the old game of alliances and etiquette when she spoke. It was with finality, and when she remained silent, the silence echoed through privy councils like thunder across fields of wheat. Thomas Cromwell, now elevated not just in name, but in unspoken authority, became her mirror and her knife. Where she ruled with presence, he ruled with precision, drafting laws that turned England into a machine of centralized, reformist power, building a bureaucracy that no noble could circumvent and no bishop could undermine. A kingdom of ink and blood where the Bible was read in English. The currency bore no cross. And every child born under the new order was taught not only who Christ was, but who Rome was not. And as young King Henry IX grew in quiet seriousness under the care of tutors drawn from the finest minds of Basel and Geneva, men who taught him not only scripture, but governance, he watched his mother, not as a boy watches a mother, but as a prince studies a sovereign. And he learned from her not bedtime tales, but the language of survival, the measured pause before answering, the value of a threat left unsaid, the weight of ceremony, the sharpness of a glance given across a council table at the right moment. And by the time he reached his 10th year, the courtiers no longer whispered about his weakness, but began to fear his calm. As for Elizabeth, her departure to Saxony was delayed again and again, not by opposition, but by design. For Anne knew the power of proximity, and while her daughter remained within the heart of the kingdom, she could be shaped, hardened, refined into more than a bride, into a political instrument of immeasurable value. And so the marriage was promised, but not delivered. The letters answered with elegant excuses, and the ambassadors entertained with fine banquets and vague assurances, because Elizabeth was not ready to be given. Not yet. Not while the kingdom still trembled on the edge of the past, and Anne's enemies still breathed. There were plots. Of course, there are always plots, but they did not flourish. They withered under the relentless watch of Cromwell's informants, under the weight of new laws that made dissent indistinguishable from treason, and under the eyes of Elizabeth herself, who, though still young, had begun to sit in on judicial hearings, not as a participant, but as witness, as signal, as reminder that power did not belong only to men with grey beards and Latin titles, but also to daughters raised in fire. And through it all, Anne remained unchanged, older, yes, and sometimes weary, but never cracked, never unjure, never forgiving. And while the world might call her monstrous in private letters or foreign courts, in England she was simply the Queen, and her name alone carried the gravity of policy, of history, of fear. She had ruled longer than most kings. She had outlived Henry's legend. She had killed the myth of fragility with every decree she signed, and every man she left broken in her wake. And when she walked through the gardens in early morning, cloak drawn tight against the chill, the leaves seemed to part before her like courtiers, bowing not out of respect, but because they must. She had become something rare, something strange, something history would never know how to name. Not a regent, not a queen mother, not a widow, a ruler, a flame, a fact, and England, no longer tethered to the body of a tyrant, no longer gasping beneath the weight of a king's moods, began at last to breathe. There was no portrait of his father in the nursery, no tapestries depicting Joust, no odes to glory sung by old men in armour, no bedtime tales whispered about how the Lion of England roared, nor how the Pope trembled before him. There was only silence, and the absence of a shadow, because Henry IX did not inherit a legacy, he inherited a wound, a kingdom still stitched together by the hands of his mother and the mind of her blacksmith's son. He was not raised to remember a father. He was raised to surpass him. From the earliest days, the child watched how people stepped when they entered a room. He noticed who bowed first, who hesitated, who smiled too much, who spoke his name too softly. He did not giggle, and he did not cry in public. He listened more than he answered. His tutors were some of the fiercest reformers in Europe, humanist, Calvinist, men who had argued theology with princes and written books that had been burned in Catholic cities. They taught him more than scripture. They taught him how to argue, how to command, how to rule, and they taught him how to endure, because while the court smiled with its lips, its bones remembered chaos. It remembered war. It remembered that crowns atop a child's head tend to fall when grown men grow hungry. So they watched him. Always. Looking for softness. For weakness. For that fatal Tudor arrogance to bloom in his soul. But it never did. He was not like his father. He did not crave glory. Nor sport. Nor applause. He craved order. The boy king learned policy not as an art, but as a necessity. His mother would summon him to the council room, even as early as 10, and make him sit in silence for hours, as lords debated taxes. Fomina. Threats from the north, and when the meeting ended, she would not praise him. She would only say, "Now tell me what the Earl of Suffolk fears." And he would answer, correctly, always. He knew when a man lied, when a man lusted, when a man calculated his place in the order of things. Henry IX became, slowly, not a boy playing at king, but a king playing at boyhood. His voice, when it broke, deepened not into thunder but into stillness. He did not raise it often. He didn't need to, and yet, for all his growing authority, power did not belong to him. Not yet. Anne still ruled, and England still followed her. There was no moment of ceremony. No clean handover of rule. Only the slow drift of decision-making from her hands to his. Cromwell noticed it first. Then the nobles. Then the foreign courts. Anne still signed decrees. Still held audiences. But it was Henry IX whom the German princes asked for. It was Henry who answered the French envoy with a Latin so sharp it left the man stammering. It was Henry who rode beside the navy on inspection tours and whose seal was beginning to matter more than hers. Anne did not resist, but she watched, carefully. She had not survived a kingdom of wolves to hand it to a child she didn't know. So she tested him, again and again. She gave him responsibility without guidance. She sent him letters disguised as nobles, requesting unlawful favors. He never granted them. She sent spies, posing as servants, to report his temper. They found no outbursts, no softness, no sins of pride, only silence, only calculation. Still, the kingdom wanted a moment, a sign, something to say. The Queen Regent would step back, and the king would rise. And so, one bitter winter morning, in the 12th year of his reign, with the snow still resting on the stone walls of Whitehall, Anne stood at court in full mourning dress, not for Henry VIII, not for any death, but for power itself. She walked to her son, kissed his hand, and knelt. She said only, "The kingdom is yours. Do not let them take it." And from that day forward, it was his. The coronation was not a new one. It was a confirmation, but it rang like thunder. The boy who had been born into silence now stood in a church, rebuilt in fire, where no Latin was spoken and no pope's blessing was needed. The bishops who anointed him were all appointed by his mother's hand. The nobles who bent knee did so not to a dynasty they feared, but to a mind they had begun to respect. Yet no reign begins without blood, and Henry's came quickly. A rebellion broke in the west, small, disperate, and poorly timed. Catholic loyalists, farmers armed with pitchforks and half-remembered scripture, claimed that the child on the throne was no king, that Anne had bewitched England, that the true heir was Mary, exiled and married to a prince who had never seen her smile. They marched on Exeter, burning prayer books, raising icons of saints. They shouted heresies. They demanded Rome return. The king responded with letters, then silence, then soldiers. He did not ride with the army. He did not need to. He sent only one command. Do not kill them for treason. Kill them for choosing ignorance. 3,000 died. The churches that sheltered them were burned. The priests who led them were hanged. Their villages were not destroyed, but they were renamed, erased from maps, from memory. When the king visited those lands months later, He was welcomed with bowed heads and locked jaws. He ate in silence. He drank from his own cup, and when a child presented him with a bouquet of flowers, he smiled, but did not take them. He said, "I am not here for love. I am here for order." And they understood. So the myth of Henry IX began to grow, not with banners, not with tournaments, but with fear, a fear not of tyranny, but of justice carried to its coldest end, a fear of a boy king who never laughed, whose mother still watched him from across council chambers, like a hawk who had not decided whether her son had teeth sharp enough to hold what she had carved for him out of blood and silence. But the kingdom obeyed. It prospered. Its navy grew. Its churches filled. Its coffers deepened. And still, Henry did not smile, because he knew what his mother had known. That peace is only the breath between betrayals. And someone, somewhere, would test him again. They always do. There were days when she no longer recognized her own hands. They had once been fine. Clever things. Hands that danced through embroidery. Hands that had turned pages in French books while young men watched her from across candlelit chambers. Hands that had touched a king's face and made him forget he was a god. But now, they trembled ever so slightly when she raised her goblet. The veins showed blue beneath a skin grown too pale. The rings she had once worn with pride now pinched, her knuckles knotted by time. And still, she would not remove them, because Anne Boleyn did not let go. Not of memory, not of grief, not of power. She had been queen longer than any woman before her, longer than some kings. She had outlasted her husband's name, outlived the lords who had plotted her death, buried her enemies one by one with words instead of tears. And now the kingdom she had bled for obeyed her son. But she knew something the others had not yet learned, that obedience is never permanent, that crowns are not nailed to skulls, but balanced like coins waiting to fall. And so she watched, every day, from the edge of the throne she had built, wondering not if Henry would fail, but if he would forget. He had grown into something unshakable, a king who read law before poetry, who chose efficiency over spectacle, who ruled as if prophecy had placed him on the throne rather than the desperate gamble of a pregnant woman and a dead man beneath a horse. But he did not love her, not the way she remembered him loving her when he was small, and clung to her shawl and called her name in the dark. No, he loved the throne. He loved the idea of a perfect kingdom, and she was not part of that perfection. She was the forge that shaped it. But no one sleeps in a forge. He no longer summoned her to council. He no longer asked for her counsel. His letters were cold, precise, royal. He did not contradict her. He simply moved past her. And it was worse than betrayal. It was erasure. So Anne began to walk the halls more often. Slowly. Yes. And always flanked by two ladies whose hands hovered near hers. Should she falter, but she never used them. She walked as she had always walked, upright, deliberate, and terrifying. And she listened to the whispers that said she was finished, to the younger ladies who giggled too loudly in corners and forgot to bow deeply enough, to the ministers who dared suggest in letters that perhaps the time had come for the Queen Dowager to retire to the countryside, to the bishop who said, softly, that even Solomon let his mother rest. She listened, and then she reminded them. She summoned one of those ministers, alone, and when he entered the small chamber, expecting perhaps a frail matriarch wrapped in velvet and too tired to speak, he found Anne Boleyn seated at the far end of the room, dressed not in morning black, but in crimson. And when he bowed, she did not bid him rise. Instead, she said, "Do you know what I remember?" "My lord," he blinked. "I remember your father." She said, "The day I miscarried a daughter who might have saved me from death. And your father said I was a withered womb, undeserving of mercy. I remember him. And I remember how he begged when Cromwell came for his titles. So now I ask myself, Should the son be forgiven what the father paid for? He fell to his knees. She let him stay there a long time, and when she finally dismissed him, he could not meet her eyes. That night, the whispers changed. They began again to speak her name, but with the old reverence, the old fear, because they had forgotten that Anne Boleyn had not survived Henry VIII by accident. She had not ruled in her son's name by charm. She had made the Church of England kneel. She had rebuilt the nobility in her image. And if her hair was now streaked with silver and her fingers slow to lace her gown, her memory was still razor-sharp. She began to write more letters, to Elizabeth in Saxony, now a young wife, sharp-tongued and sceptical, beloved by her Lutheran court, but not blinded by them, to Protestant rulers in the Low Countries, to merchants in Antwerp, quiet, subtle notes reminding them that the mother still watched what the son was building, that England's future was not yet beyond her reach, and she summoned Cromwell, not the same man he once was. Now slower, now heavy with decades of secrets, but still dangerous. Stilhash, she asked him, "Will you die before I do?" He smiled. "I might try not to, but if I do, I trust you'll handle it." They drank that night not to the past, but to the last battle yet to come, because they both knew what was coming. Time would outlive them, and the kingdom they had shaped in fire and fear would one day forget the cost. The new lords, the new bishops, the new sons born under Henry's calm reign, they would forget what it had taken to make this peace. They would think the Reformation had always belonged to them. They would think God had willed it. And Anne knew the truth. She had willed it. She had taken a kingdom, bleeding from uncertainty, and strapped it to her own survival. She had turned a queen's death sentence into a mother's crown. She had raised a boy who did not weep, and now she waited for the last moment, for the breath before silence, because she knew her name would outlive her body, but not her voice. And so, she began to write a book, not for courtiers, not for her son, not for the world, but for the girl, the one who had once asked her if queens ever get to stop fighting. She never answered then, but she would now. The skies of Saxony were not the skies of England. They were colder, cleaner, too wide and too blue, as if no clouds dared to gather there for fear of being misunderstood. And in that silence, under those strange heavens, Elizabeth learned something that no tutor had ever taught her, how it feels to be admired and yet invisible, to be bowed to and yet unheard, to be given a crown without a voice, a seat at the table without a knife to cut through it. And though she smiled and curtsied and wore the colours they chose for her, she could not stop the sensation that she was living in a mirror version of herself. Not broken, but blurred, always reflecting someone else's ambition, never her own. They called her the Princess of England, the sister of the king, the daughter of the flame, the living treaty of Protestantism, and she bore it all with elegance, with grace, with terrifying stillness, because what else was there to do when one's entire life had been prepared as a bridge? Not a destination. She was a connection, a symbol, a promesa. And not once in all the banquets or morning prayers or embassy meetings did anyone ask her what she feared, what she dreamed, what she remembered, only what she represented. Letters came regularly from home first, from her mother, written in a hand that had grown tighter and colder with each passing season. Instructions dressed as observations. Political advice laced with maternal pride, too veiled to feel warm. And later, from her brother, signed with the royal seal, and written in a tone she had once heard used on servants who were tolerated but not trusted. He asked after troop movements, after economic policies in Saxony, after doctrinal shifts in the university sermons, but never after her health, her happiness, or her soul. And it was then that she understood, with perfect clarity. No one in England remembered Elizabeth the girl, They remembered only Elizabeth the chess piece. And so she did what her mother had done before her. She adapted, not with submission, but with hunger. She learned the names of every noble in Saxony who had debts, who had secrets, who had daughters too clever and sons too vain. She watched the court not with wonder, but with calculation. And when her husband spoke of alliances and reform and the future of Europe, she smiled like a portrait and nodded like a queen, all the while thinking that every word he said was merely another stone she would need to walk across to return to herself. At night, in a chamber lit only by the dying fire and the faint creak of tapestries shifting in the draught, she began to write, not to Anne, not to Henry, not to Saxony, but to the version of herself that had been buried somewhere back in Whitehall, the girl who had learned to observe before she spoke, to wield stillness like steel, to carry 1,000 years of expectation without once dropping her eyes to the floor. And on those pages, she wrote not her grief, but her inventory, the alliances she could forge, the men she could manipulate, the theology she could recite from memory, the languages she could weaponize, the smiles she could fake until they became her own. She did not pray. She calculated, and when news came that Cromwell was ill, she read it twice, not out of sentiment, but out of consequence, because she knew what her mother must already be planning: a replacement, a new hand, a new mind, and if Anne could no longer trust her son to keep the world sharp, then she would begin to look toward her daughter not for comfort, but for continuity. Elizabeth did not write back. She only waited, because she knew what Anne did not yet understand, that once you send a daughter into the world as a weapon, you do not get her back as a child. You get her back as something else, something that waits, something that watches, something that remembers. By the time the bells of Whitehall tolled for the third day without pause, London already knew. The Queen Regent Anne Boleyn, the flame that refused to flicker, the architect of a kingdom she once built from ruin and rage, was dying. Not suddenly, not violently, not as the poets might have imagined, with poison in her cup or steel at her throat. No, it was quieter than that. The body had simply grown tired of carrying the crown. The lungs that had once shouted down bishops and burned away betrayal had begun to thin. Her eyes no longer cut. They only watched, and though no physician dared pronounce the end, the silence in the corridors said it clearly. England was preparing to let go of the woman who had once refused to die when the world ordered her to. Anne did not beg for life. She did not ask for her son. She asked for her daughter. Elizabeth arrived with snow still on her cloak, Saxon guards at her back, and a gaze. So still the courtiers stepped aside without being asked. She had grown taller, harder, more refined in posture, but not in patience. She did not kiss hands. She did not bow. She walked into the Queen's bedchamber and closed the door behind her with the finality of a sword being sheathed. Anne lay beneath a fur-lined canopy, her fingers pale, her crown nowhere in sight. The room smelled of bitter herbs and old smoke. But her voice, when she spoke, was unchanged, low, deliberate, sharp-edged as ever. "I thought you wouldn't come," Elizabeth answered. "I came because I wanted to see how you end." A long silence passed between them, the kind that does not come from absence, but from history layered, heavy, unspoken. Then Anna, half smiling, whispered, "Like a queen." As always, but Elizabeth did not smile. She stepped forward, slowly, and placed something on the edge of the bed. A book, its cover plain, its binding Saxon, pages filled not with scripture, but her own hand, observations, names, secrets, weapons dressed as words. Anna looked at it, then looked at her daughter. "You're ready," she said. "No," Elizabeth replied. "I've already begun." And in that moment, the years collapsed between them, not as reconciliation, but recognition. Neither one apologized. Neither one thanked the other, because they were not mother and daughter. Not anymore. They were two queens, one dying, one rising, and the kingdom stretched like wet wool between them. Henry did not come. He ruled from a distance, now colder than ever, more absolute than even Anne had been. His ministers spoke of consolidation, of future marriages, of naval expansions, but no one dared bring him word of Anne's condition, unless forced. He did not write. He did not send prayers. But he did issue one command. When Anne died, she was not to be buried next to Henry VIII. She was to be buried in a tomb of her own beneath a chapel she had built, beneath a window she had commissioned, where the light struck only once a day. At noon, when the shadows were shortest, there was no sermon, no Latin, only English words read from her own book of hours. And when the coffin was lowered, it was Elizabeth who held the cord, not weeping, not praying, only watching, the queen who had rewritten God's law, who had crowned herself by surviving the jaws of power, was gone, but not forgotten. Not while her son ruled with her spine, not while her daughter stood like a blade waiting to be drawn again. The kingdom did not crumble. There was no crisis, no rebellion. The world had expected a power vacuum. It found a mirror instead. Henry continued as king, methodical, divine, unreadable. Elizabeth returned to Saxony for now. But the letters began again. Different this time. She did not ask for permission. She gave direction, and when foreign courts discussed England, they used new language, the Queen's children, not the king, not the dynasty, but the bloodline of Anne. And in time, a story began to take shape. Not the one about the girl who seduced a king, not the one about the heretic who lost her head, but the one about the queen who never knelt, who buried her enemies and outlived the man who tried to end her, who raised two rulers instead of one, and whose name whispered in fear and reverence became something older than loyalty, something sharper than myth. Anne Boleyn, the queen who never died, screaming, the queen who never bowed to fate, the queen who, even in death, ruled, and somewhere, far from London, in a quiet room lined with parchment and steel, Elizabeth turned the last page of her own notes, dipped her kill, and began writing a letter to no one. It began with 4 words. I am not finished. And she wasn't. Not yet.